If we can assume that the theories of capitalism were concomitant on the success of the Industrial Revolution, and if we can assume that the development of socio-economic theory opposed to capitalism, that is Marxism and socialism, was concomitant on the generation of a new social order by the Industrial Revolution, can we ask the question, what's going to happen to our theories of socio-political organisation in the years ahead if it can be assumed that we've now entered the technological revolution? Economic liberalism, or capitalism, had had its theories and foundations fairly well established by the middle of the 19th century. Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, John Locke, the Marquis of Halifax and John Stuart Mill were some of the prominent people associated with this task. Their theories found successful application in liberal and conservative political parties. Socialism had a more defined period of gestation, from the French Revolution till its application as an electorally successful political party in the latter parts of the 19th century. Marxism, as a variant, didn't become acceptable until well into the 20th century. If we look at political development in the 20th century from a sufficiently broad viewpoint, we can observe that socialism has been subjected to much self-analysis, criticism, and theoretical development. It's also emerged as the dominant theoretical basis for government in a majority of countries. Capitalism, on the other hand, has not been subject to much self-analysis. It has developed little in theoretical study, but it has expanded in practical economic application through business enterprise in free society. In the shrinking free world, it has maintained an overall ascendancy over its opponents, but its policies have reflected the influence of socialist thought through the growth of the welfare state and the drift towards more government intervention in social and business life. Probably as a result of the ascendancy of socialism or its mutant strains now governing some 55% of the world's population, the theoretical foundations of economic liberalism are beginning to be subjected to self-scrutiny. This scrutiny is being carried out by people variously described as the New Right, Neo-conservatives, Liberal conservatives, or libertarians. As I've indicated in the introduction, the development that we're looking at has attached to it a number of names. It perplexes me as to which is the most suitable name to use in the explanatory parts of the program. Some names, neo-conservative for example, are unacceptable to those who call themselves libertarian, and libertarian itself is unacceptable to those who call themselves Whigs or classical liberals. So with some license, I use the term New Right. But as we proceed, you'll find it's far from a satisfactory compromise. The emergence of the New Right is an interesting phenomenon. If it continues, it should make for fascinating politics in the decade ahead. One commentator, Greg Sheridan, put it like this in the Bulletin recently. The New Right, although arguing in economic terms, appears not to be arguing from a self-interested point of view, as apologists for free enterprise businessmen. Their arguments are academic. Few of the spokesmen we could find were employed in the private business sector. And their backgrounds, when analysed against the conventional left-centre-right political spectrum, are not altogether what one might expect either.
We believe in absolute freedom of choice, freedom of property rights, freedom to do, to sell or trade, whatever you wish. And so in that respect, we're right-wing. On the other hand, we're against intervention in other countries. We're against imperialism, we're against war. We believe that people have the right to buy, sell, smoke, drink, whatever material they wish. We believe people have a right to read and write whatever they wish. So on those issues, we're left-wing. And the contemporary spectrum, left-right, just doesn't take into account the fact that we accept freedom from the right and freedom from the left.
The new right isn't all youth. Included in its ranks is one of Australia's most controversial, yet consistent, some might even say persistent, political and social commentators, Mr. Bob Santamaria.
I suppose it's usual to say that these catchwords right and left are cliches, but I would think it's absurd to put me on the right as I understand the right. If the right is the party of the stability of the existing order compared with those who want radical social change, I am on the left. And those who are on the right are those who want what they call broadly socialism in its Marxist or other varieties, and those who want the present managed capitalism. Because it seems to me that the predominant characteristic of both is a highly bureaucratised society in which the individual and the family don't count at all.
Whether we like it or not, in this age of slick advertising, we're each carefully categorised according to our buying habits, lifestyles, religious affiliation, education, voting habits, as well as a host of other parameters. Numerous models have been devised to explain our socio-political complexion. And besides explaining, a model has another use in predicting the likely popularity of new political ideas or policies. Ronald Conway, in his books The Great Australian Stupor and The Land of the Long Weekend, has developed such a model which may help to better explain the place of the new right.
This is the first of four groups based upon psychological nurture patterns which I think have affected socioeconomic life in this country and also our political institutions. I call it the patrist authoritarian group. It represents those people in society upholding traditional laissez-faire capitalism, who believe that social merit and power is based on the possession of wealth and the possession of expertise which can be bought by wealth. It's still very prominent in society, and it represents the basis for most of our most effective private companies and institutions. On the other hand, we have here what I term the patrist conservative social group. This group is much more concerned with what a person is than what they have. They're concerned with traditional Christian values insofar as they still survive among us. It believes in the family and the values originating from the family, and in personal affinities as the basis of a just political order. It does not believe in huge power structures. It might be described as one of the groups that believes in its own quiet way that small is beautiful. I suppose you could say that this group here, what I call the matrist indulgent group, also believes that small is beautiful. But it is based upon principles of hedonism and the pursuit of pleasure, which are foreign to the other two groups. It believes in the state as a nurturant body. It believes in the state instead of the family as the source of all political benefits. It tends to support welfarist policies. It believes in egalitarianism, and this egalitarianism gets perilously close to notions of uniformity. Over here we have a group quite familiar to Australians, traditionally what I might call the Ned Kelly group, the fraternalist anarchic group, which believes in change, any form of change, which believes that the lines of authority are essentially horizontal. It is distrustful of power structures, of authority, of hierarchies of any kind, and believes only in a rather wary association among the peer group, the extreme radical unionist. In the past, the street fighter, the backstreet push. Of course, in some of its more mindless aspects, you of course have the bikie, submitting to no particular social norms or mores, whatever.
Ron, I'm not the fifth dimension to your model. I'm here to ask you a question. Yeah. Where does the new right fit into your model?
In a sense, I think that what we're seeing is a resurgence of the old right, this group here. The excesses of welfarism in the last 25 years have given the new right, or the patrist authoritarian groups, a new credibility. They believe that low taxation, a hands-off policy towards private aggrandisement, more liberal concessions for companies, getting the economy going by allowing them a free hand. I suppose their representatives would be ably represented by Edward St John, Joe Belkey-Peterson, Sir Charles Court, and of course the living incarnation of the lot would be Lang Hancock, the original hard-nosed Patrist authoritarian. Over here, of course, we have the Patrist conservatives, which I think are still a supporting minority. They have a distrustful but uneasy relationship with this group because most Australians are not interested in ideals to a large extent. They're interested in pragmatic issues. And they've had to form an uneasy alliance with this group because it controls a lot of the press, a lot of the media, a lot of the power structures. But with a bit of luck, it might be able to use the rocket propulsion of this group in order to get through to people to give forth their message. I think this group would believe in getting through to the people to educate them, rather than perhaps this group who believes that the masses should be given what's good for them.
True Liberals want to take it, they want a lot of change, so it's quite wrong to talk about them as being conservative. I think they want to change things quite radically in a liberal direction. They want more competition.
People are looking for new and less authoritarian ways of bringing about change.
There are people who don't seem not to like the idea that things happen automatically, that the market is an automatic allocator of resources. The market seems to raise the well-being without anybody doing it directly.
I put the solution fairly and squarely in a demand that governments, because governments are finally responsible in these matters, in a sense reintegrate the institution of the family, not as a centre of love and affection, which I presume, but as a simple functioning mechanism for providing the basic social services, which is the care of the very young, the sick and the old.
And the moral question that people have to face is what rights do people have? How can you best protect these rights? Is the state the best means of achieving this protection, or is in fact the state, as libertarians believe, the major enemy?
Now, if the family generally throughout a particular society is doing this, you can see immediately that you've cut out half the reasons for the existence of bureaucracies. The welfare bureaucracy wouldn't completely go, of course, but more than half of it would go. Taxation would be diminished to that extent.
There's a lot more scepticism about what governments can achieve. I think there's a much wider spread feeling now that governments are overextended and overburdened, and that they've promised more than they can perform.
Before analysing more closely what the so-called New Right is saying, it is perhaps instructive to have a closer look at who they are. Leo Hawkins, with a background in Liberal Party politics and now lecturing in politics and local government at RMIT, is well placed as an observer. Leo, can we start overseas?
Yes, Brian, I think that's where most of the initiatives are occurring. There are three groups of people involved that I am conscious of. The first is aggressive young businessmen, the products of management education and not of the feather bedding of the 30s. Secondly, there are academics who are, as you would wish, criticising their society, and particularly so because of the way in which their institutions have been run over the last few years on communal basis. And finally, there's concerned and articulate members of the general public who are increasingly conscious that government activities have grown so big that they no longer help them, they constrain them.
Where are these groups most obvious overseas? In America or Germany or where?
I think that we're more conscious of the ones in America, but in the future we'll see more from Britain, because Mrs. Thatcher, and particularly her ideological guru, Sir Keith Joseph, are trying in Britain to legislate for the first time post-war in Europe some important aspects of the conservative ideology.
And then coming home to Australia, what's the situation here with the New Right? Are there any groups emerging here?
Well, the problem with the New Right in Australia is that it's got tied up with racism. When people talk about the right wing here, they tend to think in terms of League of Rights and so on, and that's an image problem that the New Right has. But increasingly we're seeing small government advocated both at local level in terms of smaller local councils and so on, and at government level where Herculean efforts are being made to restrain, indeed reverse, the inevitable or seemingly inevitable increase in the size of bureaucracy.
And what about groups like Greg Lindsay's Centre for Independent Studies?
Yes, I think that's the most important development. That deals with the second group I mentioned, the academics. Hitherto in Australia these have not been a significant part of the new right. In Melbourne we have the Institute of Public Affairs, a very long-standing organisation which has dealt with or sought to put the view of businessmen who think along these lines, and I think increasingly we're observing in the Liberal Party and really to an extent in the Democrats the community view being expressed for smaller and therefore more responsive government.
The common thread running through the outlook of the various groups associated with the new right is an abhorrence of the growing power of the state. If one were to look no further, one could assume from this that its growth is merely reactive, the pendulum starting to swing back the other way. But the development appears to be more substantial than the actions and reactions observed in political party allegiances on a day-to-day basis. Max Harris, in a recent column in The Australian, stated the outlook of the new right, or new conservatism as he labels it, more positively. At the heart of the new conservatism is the radical and indeed revolutionary aphorism of the late E.F. Shoemaker that small is beautiful.
Well, I think that there's a lot of romanticism here that would lead you to a sort of an economic system that is purely primitive. But if you apply that to a modern technological society, to the use of technology, and are sufficiently able to exclude capital and unions as dictating the way in which that technology is used, well, small is beautiful can be very viable.
Small is beautiful, or as you put it, small is smart.
Yes, well, small is beautiful. I think we're increasingly conscious that every time you add another layer onto an organisation, somehow it seems to develop a life and an interest of its own that means that it's outside the control either of the people in it or the people outside it. And I think the lesson of studying human organisations as we have the last 30, 40 years in the same way as medical bodies before studying human organisations is that if they are to be responsive, if they are to give satisfaction and a sense of commitment to the people in them, then we've got to go for every possible form of technology that will reduce them in size.
Discussions to do with politics and society must inevitably return to that most fundamental of questions, money, or more properly, economics. It's in the realm of economics that one finds the most coherence between what the various elements of the new right are saying. Given coherence through the proposition that government intervention must be reduced, there are still a number of schools of thinking on the most expeditious method of achieving this. The two most important are broadly defined as the monetarist school, headed by Milton Friedman, and Friedrich von Hayek's Austrian school.
The monetarists offer well, to be quite honest, to them, they do not offer a complete solution. What they do say is that if one controls the supply of money, then one removes a certain degree of instability. And again, if one is going to be fair to them, this is about as far as they're willing to go.
There's another group that has always had a strong market orientation. They like to think of themselves as 19th century liberals, Adam Smith, followers of Adam Smith, and I put myself pretty much in that category. That group has always felt that markets were at the heart of the matter, markets were the guts of economics. And they've always questioned, I think, whether intervention policies of the Keynesian variety would work. Hayek is probably one of its most notable advocate. The Hayek school has been insignificant in terms of numbers until recently. It is now growing, and you can see this within Australia, I think.
The Austrians suggest that one needs to go beyond merely looking at the macro picture, as it were, merely looking at aggregates like the total level of employment or supply of money. One needs to inquire into the way in which information is passed through the economic system, and this means again looking at prices set in different markets for different products for different kinds of labor. And the Austrians argue that with the attempt in the past to maintain the maximum level of employment, and also with the attempt to maintain particular lines of employment, particular lines of production, the unintended consequences were to clog up the channels of information, and therefore we now do not know really which lines of employment can be sustained without subsidy, which lines of production can be sustained without subsidy. And this basically is, in a sense, the major economic problem which will recur and which will have to be faced one way or the other, I think, in the decades to come.
Hayek is saying that we shouldn't really expect anything much of government intervention. That true liberty will only follow from economic freedom, and we must have almost complete economic freedom if we are to achieve any political liberty. He wishes to write constitutions which facilitate the achievement of economic liberty. He also would support, for example, the almost total withdrawal of central banking. He would tend to advocate, or he's advocated at times, a move back to private currency. Friedman doesn't go that far. Friedman just wishes to put manacles around the central bank. He wishes the central bank to be constrained, as the Reserve Bank of Australia in our case, to be constrained to pursue relatively stationary objectives, that is, constant rate of growth of the money supply, to not use discretionary policy, not to fine-tune the economy. And his reason for that is empirical. It doesn't work. Fine-tuning doesn't work. I think Hayek might go a bit further and make case against almost all forms of intervention, whereas Friedman, on occasion, has advocated intervention. So I think one interesting,
perhaps the policies where one can most clearly see the tie between the economic arguments and the humanitarian philosophy of the new right are proposals for negative income tax and education funding by way of vouchers.
Negative tax system is one in which if your income is zero, the government pays you, say, $1,500 per year. And as your income rises from zero, you pay back, say, 35 or 40% to government, and there's a flat rate right through. Now, what this means is that if you're currently unemployed, you don't lose your entire unemployment benefit when you get a job. Or if you're a handicapped person, you don't face the indignity of losing your welfare support entirely if you happen to earn an extra $10 a week. So negative income tax is a way of replacing a very interventionist welfare system, a very discretionary system, with an across-the-board program. The negative income tax systems basically say we care about people rather than the situations people are in. It's not clear whether negative income tax is a viable proposition. As you may know, the Whitlam government looked at it, and other governments have looked at it. And basically, most governments are standing back from it as a nice idea that doesn't seem to be practical. But it does represent an alternative way of running the welfare system.
It sounds to me very much like the voucher system in education.
Yeah.
They're standing back from that in the same way.
Yes, again, I think there have been experiments with vouchers. That is, rather than have a situation where education's entirely free if you go to that school and costs $2,000 a year if you go to this school, everybody is given a voucher, or the parents are given a voucher, one voucher per school-aged child, and they may take that voucher to the school of their choice. The school of their choice then gets so much money, according to the value of the voucher. So a school that is popular with parents and children will tend to attract more resources and the capacity to hire more teachers. A school which is unpopular loses resources. So what we've done is restore some consumer sovereignty over education.
The most heartening aspect I've found in this reawakening is an acknowledgement that society, its operations and its problems can't be neatly pigeonholed into little boxes. An acknowledgement that we need to look at things from some sort of overall perspective. In this present century, this sort of outlook has tended to become the preserve of the left. The managers of capital have too often found it convenient to find little boxes. For example, the current comment in the newspapers about the division between, say, sport and politics, or trade and foreign policy. Or some people seem to be able to find a neat little division between this is business and that is morality. The new right, in what they're writing and talking about, seem to be throwing out a challenge to the establishment. Irving Kristol, who's the doyen of the neo-conservative movement in the United States and an academic, provided an example of this in an article published in the Wall Street Journal recently. He writes, "There have been hopeful signs of progressive adaptation to the need for an economic policy to spur economic growth instead of being indifferent or hostile to it. It seems clear that in the 1980s it will be foreign policy, not domestic economic policy, that will be decisive for economic growth and for our destiny in general. If the 70s were dominated by considerations of domestic economic policy, the 80s are going to be dominated by considerations of foreign and military policy. A whole new set of priorities will have to be established as we come to grips with the fact that the American economy does not exist in isolation from world politics. It is only so long as economic growth remains a credible reality that democracy will remain an actuality. It is the expectation of tomorrow's bigger pie, from which everyone will receive a larger slice, that prevents people from fighting to the bitter end over the division of today's pie."
Australia is a minor power. It will always be subject to strong changes in the environment. At present, our international environment is very fluid. There's a strong balance, or a close balance between the major forces at work, and that gives us more room to manoeuvre than we've been used to. But we will do what the big powers tell us in the international scene, and then because we're wired into this incredible global village, we will pick up the ideas and attitudes from overseas. Those will have a powerful impact. But I also hope that in Australia, where we've got so many opportunities to experiment, so many resources to throw into the pursuit of solutions to pressing problems, that we'll make a more than proportionate contribution to the international debate.
I think that Australia is strategically essential to any power which wishes to control the Eastern Indian Ocean, the Southern Ocean and the Western Pacific Ocean. Because you see, we're an enormous stable aircraft carrier at the pivot of the three oceans, and also pointing to the Southeast Asian archipelago. Secondly, in terms of our raw material resources, we are in a most enviable situation. We're probably one of the richest two continents in the world. Now, I don't believe that a population of 15 million people, which will, by the end of the century, will be something like 17 million people, is going to be allowed to monopolise that and not to produce, as we're not producing. And so I am quite certain that there will be some foreign threat, which may be military, but doesn't have to be military, to Australia.
And from the analysis of who the new right is and what they're saying, we turn to the more important questions of this program. Why is there this reawakening now? And is it in some way related to technological change, the technological revolution? These questions are the guts of this program. They're the questions I was most trying to answer when I set out to make the program. Yet when I come to review what I've got, the people I've spoken to haven't answered it, or at least in the terms that I wanted it answered anyway. The answers to the questions must probably remain open. But I think it's still important to have a look at what the new right says about it. They raise further fundamental problems that our post-industrial society must try to answer. Leo, why is there this new interest in liberal and conservative political philosophy at this time?
Because I think we've had the best part of 30 years serious trial of the socialist liberal mix, and really the lesson of the 50s or certainly the 60s and the 70s is it doesn't work.
The reason I can see significant economic difficulties appearing is because of the long-term consequences of the policies that were followed in the past. Policies that were intended to produce the maximum employment within the shortest period of time and to try and maintain this maximum of employment. Now, the man who was chiefly responsible for getting such a view adopted, Keynes, explicitly denied any interest in the long term. He said, in the long term, we are all dead. Now, unfortunately, some of us might die, but the rest of us have to continue on. And the long-term consequences don't go away simply because one isn't interested in them. The long-term consequences of simply looking at the total volume of employment is that the pattern of employment then becomes more and more difficult to sustain. People are drawn into lines of employment that cannot be maintained for a long period of time, and the wrong sort of information is fed through the price system.
The record of government is shocking, and so I think this pragmatic fact is forcing an increasing number of people to be sceptical about big government, the growth of bureaucracy and the corporate state. And I think that's it doesn't work. It's as simple as that, and that's why people are questioning big government more than ever before.
There is a motivation coming from some young groups in particular based on questions of rights of the individual, and these people are very religious about their views, if you like, or evangelistic.
Well, libertarians have got several ideas about why things are happening right now. I tend to favour the view that since the Second World War, at least, we've seen the massive rise in the size of the state, in its powers. America has taken over the colonial heritage of England and France. Russia has risen to become a superpower. There have been massive numbers of third world revolutions. And I think old Ludwig von Mises, the great classical liberal economist, summed it up when he said that the rise of the state is essentially a parasitical thing. It has to feed off the productive efforts of the mass of the people. And it can only do this whilst there is wealth in the community to tap into. And one of the consequences of this, of decades of taxing, inflating and controlling people, he called it the reserve fund. Now, the fat in society has been eaten away until such a stage has been reached where every time the government does something, the effect is immediately felt. And the effects are coming on one after the other. And people are suddenly realising that when the government does something, there are bad consequences. For example, the energy crisis, inflation, unemployment, recession, are all problems that are suddenly bunching up in the 70s. And I think people are suddenly realising that there is a fundamental crisis and are responding to it by protesting, by organising, by discussing new ideas and issues.
Then there are the pragmatists who say, oh, look, you know, we thought this could work, but it hasn't happened. So maybe this is better. Let's try that. Now, to me, there seems to be not the same sort of depth of intellectual commitment or philosophical commitment to this, but at least there is a change.
I think that while Friedmanite economics, voucher systems, reverse income tax originated with those who are wrongly labelled as right, but nevertheless labelled as right. I do see quite a number of people, really from an original left-wing source, coming to them because they now have become frightened of the state. Not that the state is going to run concentration camps. They hadn't seen 1990 before, but they just are fed up with the idea that a bureaucracy in Canberra, which is a caste, not a class, but a caste, child ultimately succeeding father, which have got 40%, have organised for themselves a 40% higher average weekly family income than anybody else in Australia, which have organised for themselves a system of superannuation, which is guaranteed against inflation, that these people, not governments whom they elect, should have the final determination over the lives of human beings. And so what they're saying is, let the state collect the money and increasingly let it dispense the money to people so that they can make their own choices. And I think all of that is good. But not on a purely individualist basis, the family, because every individual needs a social support.
Probably happen is a transference of attention from the primary industries, which have become far more machinery intensive, from secondary industries, which also have become far more machinery intensive, to the tertiary sector of services and so on and so on and so on. Now, of course, if the society isn't creating the wealth in the other two sectors, the tertiary sector, which is sort of services the other two, certainly won't be able to grow.
If wage rates don't reflect the need for those, the need to make those changes, then how will the workers know what industries to move into? And that's one of the rigidities that minimum wages and unionisation and arbitration builds into the economy. People cannot respond to those changes because the market rates, wage rates, do not exist.
What we have to do is to remove the strictures on the society that impede the sort of social changes that go along with it.
I think the really interesting thing is the extent to which it will tend to centralise power and the extent to which it may actually enable power to be decentralised. I think you have technological change taking us in both those directions. In the 1950s and 1960s, the big tendency of technology, for example, in my line of business, in the press, was for it to concentrate ownership and control more and more in fewer and fewer hands because of the economies of scale of large printing presses. But now with photo setting and computerised systems, and the elimination of those very expensive hot metal machines, modern technology has given us the opportunity to decentralise power in the press. And similarly, I understand in telecommunications, the development of microwave technology with dishes and satellites and so on enables you to get away from the kind of centralisation that you have with a wired system of the telecom kind.
Technology itself is going to be, I think, side by side with bureaucracy, with what is happening to the family, with what is happening to pressure groups, the most important single factor that is going to shape Australian and Western society.
Now, on the other hand, the good scenario is that technology is making it more and more possible for individuals to survive, or for their survival to take a smaller proportion of their time. If you're a tribesman living in central India or a peasant living in Egypt, you've got to spend 90% of your time simply surviving. We have a technology that enables us to spend a small percentage, perhaps 20-30% of our time. The rest of it we can use for the improvement of our life, to the improvement of our community and so on. So I would see that technology offers us that choice. And I'm very concerned that Australia is going the centralising route. Because of the power of bureaucracies, because of the power of the centering influences that are in our community, we are facing that way. And that's one of the reasons why I'm most interested in conservative ideology, because I think it does force people who are making apparently value-free technical choices to consider the ideological implications of what they're doing.
One of the questions worthy of investigation in a program like this is the impact of change on the party political system in Australia. Patrick, to me you seem to be a fairly assiduous commentator on the direction political parties are taking in Australia. In your book, Lucky Country Reborn, you predicted that we'd move towards the United States model. How do you see that occurring?
I think it's still going on, Brian. I think, as I imagined then, when is it now? That's going back to 1976, that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party will come apart. I think we're seeing this now in the friction, very keen friction between Bob Hawke and the more extreme left-wing elements of the Labor Party, the Bill Hartleys and these people. And we're seeing it too in I think it's the dilemma of the Liberal Party at the moment. It has power in Canberra and doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't know where it is in New South Wales, where it's in opposition, and it doesn't exactly know where it is in Victoria, where it's in government. It got government almost by default in South Australia, and still doesn't quite know where it is. I don't know what's going to happen in the Liberal Party, but I think when we run into some turbulent years, as we will ahead, I hope we talk about them, the Liberal Party will sort of blow up, as the Labor Party is, I think, starting to do now. I could be wrong about the Labor Party. The explosion may not come immediately, but I think what we're seeing are signs of it.
That's surprising. You're saying that it's more likely in the Liberal Party than the Labor Party, and yet the Labor Party at the moment seems to be the one where the friction is public.
Oh yes, the friction is very public in the Labor Party. I think it's more internal in the Liberal Party, and they're really still, I think you could say, looking for a leader, looking for another Menzies.
Well, while Patrick Tennyson appears quite confident that there'll be major changes in our political parties over the next decade or so, we'll leave his opinion on what place he sees the new right playing or not playing in this hanging for a couple of minutes. In the meantime, how do they see their influence on the party political structure?
It's definitely there. It's slow to come through, but each time there's an election, there's a new generation of politicians come into Parliament, and although they're by no means the majority, the proportion of politicians of a sceptical bent, if you like, is much higher than it was 10 years ago.
For example, in the Liberal Party, are these the people that are called the axes in the backbench? And
Yes, I think that's true to say. There's probably 20 or 30 of them. They're probably about a third of the Liberal Party and Country Party. And even within the Labor Party, you have some of this feeling, less so. They're much more attached to their socialist delusions?
In many ways, I think politicians are, in a sense, simply led by events. Things happen, they have to do something about it or be seen to be doing something about it, bearing in mind always the date of the next possible election. And this is the kind of time frame within which they operate. To a large extent, I think, therefore, it's a question of the changes in the perceptions of the people who feed ideas into politicians, the people whom politicians listen to, rather than the politicians themselves. In many ways, I think politicians are simply weather vanes. Now, the real question, therefore, is the extent to which the advisors of politicians, those to whom they talk and those to whom they listen, themselves have begun to perceive the fact that much that was possible in the past is now no longer possible, and that in the future, one is going to have to deal with a number of undesired consequences, a number of undesired economic phenomena, which are not going to go away because one doesn't like them, but which are going to persist and recur.
Is that going to call for a tougher breed of politician then?
I think it's going to call for a more perceptive type of politician. To a very large extent, politicians are not masters of events, they're followers.
I don't think it's quite reached the level of political parties. They're usually the last people to respond to change like this. They don't have the concepts yet to grapple with these problems. Both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party don't really know what's happening to the economy. The economic paradigms they've used in the past are just not working. They can't explain why we have inflation and recession at the same time. They can't understand why unemployment keeps increasing in spite of the tinkering that they're doing with the economy.
And I don't really foresee any major changes in the party political structure over the next 10 years. And I regret that very much, because I don't think that either major party is equipped to handle the defence, foreign policy, economic and social problems of the country. Simply because they won't take on the bureaucracy. On the other hand, the concept that some third party could arise, it's not inconceivable if there were a major accident that we can't foresee. But if you envisage a relatively prosperous society, living prosperously on mineral resources until the day of reckoning, then I don't see very much chance of a political change.
So in 1990, you see that we'll have a Liberal Party and a Labor Party much as we have today.
Unless there has been, this unless is very important to me, I simply don't believe that the change in the strategic situation in East Asia is going to permit Australia to isolate itself from the rest of the world. But short of that, if we could exclude all of those factors, and I repeat, I don't exclude them, then I don't see any major political change in this country. Life is simply too good in the purely material sense for too many people.
I indicated earlier that I felt the prime question that this program was based on, the relationship between technological change and socio-political organisation, had not been answered by those to whom I'd spoken. This has not disappointed me, nor has it surprised me. The question is a tough one to answer. To begin with, it's based on a supposition. Has the technological revolution begun? Perhaps I went to the wrong people in search of answers. If the new right is to provide some sort of philosophical framework for socio-political organisation sans technology, should I have perhaps sought detached observers? But detached observers, they're hard to come by at any time. In the final analysis, perhaps the only detached observer is history. But from our limited perspective of the now, it still seems a necessary drive to speculate. And for my part, my speculations are still cushioned by provisos. If, as some commentators postulate, the rise of the new right is simply a pragmatic development, the pendulum swinging back the other way, then I consign it to the category of the hundreds of political movements throughout the world in each decade that briefly surface, make a noise, and are then lost to our memory. On the other hand, if it is driven by some more substantial philosophical base, a search for an answer to the oldest unanswered question there is, who are we, why are we here, what's the meaning of life, then I give it a much greater chance of reaching eventual dominance. To me, the new right does seem to be searching for an answer. And perhaps if they never find an answer, they'll provide civilization with a further brief respite from the more numerous demagogues who are forever promising utopia on a silver platter. Demagogues who parade openly as tyrants, or more furtively as nice guys. Everybody's friend, the plastic politician. But the outlook for the new right doesn't look that bright if what Patrick Tennyson sees is true.
I don't agree with it at all. I think it's altogether wrong. I think it's a lot of wishful thinking by a group of academics who are like the public servants in Canberra, very isolated from the community, and who are unaware of the immense power of the public servants in Canberra. No, I think this is mere wishful thinking. A lot of these academics earlier were Whitlam supporters. They can't quite wear the Liberal Party completely, so they're looking for some sort of alternative. Max Harris is on this sort of kick too, but Max doesn't know, which camp he's in, or whether he's in Adelaide or Sydney or Zurich or selling books in book fairs in Frankfurt or anywhere.
Optimism in the long run, not in the short term. Because I can see that things are going to get worse before they get better.
There are people who are very pessimistic, and they tend to be the people who have been favouring intervention. The optimists seem to me to include the free traders, the market-oriented people, the people who feel that the 70s have taught us a lesson, the people who feel that a closer study of the Great Depression and policies during the Depression have also taught us a lesson that we shouldn't use, that we shouldn't have done what we did in that period.
I think that you'll find that just as the institutions of bigness went inevitably to destruction after Diocletian in the 4th century, but it took a century, and led ultimately through blood, sweat and tears to the growth of feudalism. We are now, over a long period, witnessing a new transformation like this. Now, I think our real problem is that from about 1982 onwards, unless there's some radical change that I can foresee, it is the period of Soviet military supremacy, absolute supremacy in the world. And I don't know what the political and economic results will be.
Oh, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I think that's the history of the world. There are major hiccups, I'm not arguing that, but I am definitely optimistic. I do believe that the evidence proves that given the opportunity to choose, 8 times out of 10, which is a pretty good average, people choose at least a satisfying solution and usually an optimum solution.
Ron, how successful do you see this new right movement as being?
It will be successful only so far as it wakes up to the fact that the left has made most of the running in this country in terms of ideas and principles, and that it has the highest appeal to the younger generation. It will succeed only if it stops mouthing mindless cliches like progress. Progress toward what? Development. Where does development end and exploitation and rape of the environment end? I think it's got to get some really good ideas, men, instead of just dishing out the same old cliches, which are mainly based upon a shallow appeal to human appetites.
On the road to any success they may have, the new right has one enormous obstacle to overcome. It's an obstacle intrinsic to what they stand for, the belief in the worth of the individual. It seems that deeply ingrained in their psyche is the drive to be individualists themselves. So they tend not to organise, not to muster strength, not to work as a group. Their voices tend to be lone voices, linked only to others by the fact that they're saying roughly the same thing. That while there's a common core of unity in ideas, there is still much diversity, as I hope the last hour has demonstrated. And perhaps this is nowhere more clearly evident than in the fact that they can't even agree amongst themselves on what best to call themselves. What's in a name?
I don't think you can really go past conservative. Now, only in Australia that the word conservative has the same pejorative overtones as socialist or even communist. Bob Hawke grunts out, "They're conservatives."
The word liberal has been particularly misused by Americans to the extent that if you're called a liberal in America, you're a socialist, and they don't use the term socialist in America. I think as I understand it anyway, in the British tradition, what we're talking about is called liberal.
The Whig view recognizes that the institutions that have grown up are the results of human action but not of human design. One can no more build a language or a system of law than one can set about deliberately building a tree.
Well, conservative is an honourable ideological tradition, and I believe that that word best carries with it the concepts that are involved that we're talking about here. The new right is too redolent of fascism and racism. Libertarianism is misunderstood by most people. If it was understood, I wouldn't be unhappy with it.
The Liberals always have a problem, that is whether they're Liberals or Conservatives. And traditionally, I think they've been Conservatives. They've been people who've run the status quo without any particular sense of direction at all. Recently, they have been influenced by libertarian, liberal, if you like, principles and ideas under the stimulus that we've been speaking of, with the revival of liberal philosophies.
Conservative, as far as I'm concerned, is a person who has a rather too easy satisfaction with the powers of the government. In other words, they're likely to use them if they can.
Neo-conservative, I think, is probably the best description because it is, in itself, something of an adaptation of the mainstream of conservatism.
In the long run, we invent labels for purposes of clarification. They're coat hangers for ideas. When we really persuade ourselves that they mean something absolute, we're in trouble. Conservative, neo-conservative, Whig conservative, radical conservative. What's in a name?